Hi, Tim.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning. Welcome to this UMICHile conversations that I called, and the idea is to reconnect with all my old friends from University of Michigan.
It's
How are
wonderful.
you, Tim?
I'm fine. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to have you. I wore my Michigan shirt for you.
Thank you.
Uh, I did
This is
that to reconnect with our old Block M heritage.
thank you, Tim. Thank you for being with us this morning.
Thank you. This is wonderful.
Um,
Yeah.
I mean, these Sundays have been very special to me because I start reconnecting with everyone, but also like naturally you start thinking about things that we did together, no?
Absolutely.
And although with saxophone, it is not so much repertoire that we share. Me as a violinist, I always had wonderful memories sharing with you. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so
And
much.
and I always start with the question that where are you from and how music came into your life.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in Houston, Texas. So I was a Texas boy that moved up north for university, for school. But um, growing up in the state of Texas, not a lot of people internationally know or realize how important music is in the schools, in the school system in in Texas. Texas is legendary in the United States for its orchestra and band programs. It's like it's known for high school football and orchestra and band, marching band, all of these things. So I grew up with just music all around me and a very advanced band program. I didn't realize at the time just how advanced it was because we were just always doing what our conductors and band directors told us to do. But as I began to explore, festivals and summer camps and moving out of the state in the summertime, I started to realize just how lucky I was to have such a terrific music program to be a part of. So I was taking private lessons very early. I was very inspired to to play classical music and jazz, and eventually I started going to summer camps, and I eventually went to Interlochen and the famous music camp in northern Michigan, the oldest music camp in the United States. So this is where I found my inspiration. It was, and I know you know about Interlochen because we both were teachers there at the same time
Exactly.
for the Michigan All-State program, and but when I was there as a student, that's where I met my teacher, my eventual teacher, Donald Cinta, and who who would become my professor and who I would study with at the University of Michigan. So that he was the administrator, the head administrator, as you remember, of the Interlochen All-State program, which was only for Michigan students. And so, but I got to meet him, I got to play for him, I got to play in master class, and then he recruited me to Michigan. But he was already a legend. I mean, he's been a legend in our field forever. Well, I thought maybe I'll share a picture of him. Is that okay?
Yes,
Maybe
please.
for folks that might not have a sense of him. So this is a picture of Donald Cinta. This was probably maybe this picture is maybe 10 or 15 years old, and he looks wonderful. He looks exactly the same now. He's 82 years old now, and he was my inspiration even from eighth or ninth grade. Ninth grade, I was listening to his recordings, his albums, very famous albums in the saxophone world, and so that's what led me to Michigan and eventually meeting you.
Yes, yes. It's wonderful because at Michigan, Donald Cinta was really an important name, and I remember passing through the band room and he would be always around. No,
Mhm.
very, very, very nice man. And I remember my times at Interlochen when I was teaching there for the All State program. I just had a blast with him. You know, so easygoing and really, really, I have really beautiful memories sharing also with him. This is great.
Yeah, he
And
was.
and
Yeah.
and Tim, I have a question. When you started, did you started playing saxophone right away, or you started playing clarinet? I don't know. Could you tell me how is the process to play the saxophone?
Yeah, I think it can go either. It can go one way or another. Some people might when we were allowed in the music programs in the public school music programs, and we often have a choice. We get to choose our instruments, you know. And of course, before that, I mean, when I was much younger, probably I don't know, maybe when I was around 8 or 9 years old, I did take some piano lessons.
Mhm.
Um, but I don't think I ever really connected with it as something I wanted to do much more seriously. But I just enjoyed it, and I think that helped me. I mean, that certainly the piano training helps your ears and just
Yeah.
you know visualizing the keyboard and all of it. But in fifth grade, so fifth grade, which is I guess I would have been 11 or so. I was given the choice of instrument I would like to play in band in junior high school, in
Mhm.
middle school. I always wanted to play the saxophone, so I did get to play. I did get to choose that instrument immediately.
Mhm.
Sometimes, if a person is a little small, a smaller child, they may not be able to choose the saxophone because it's just bigger. It's bigger than the clarinet. And oftentimes, if a child is a little smaller, they may say you can start on the clarinet and maybe move to bassoon or saxophone or something else.
Okay.
So yeah, so I did get to choose the saxophone immediately, and
Awesome.
the saxophone program. In my sixth grade program, we all had full classes on the individual instruments. So we did not have a band. We didn't throw a band together. In my program, where I grew up, every instrument had its own. For one whole year, every instrument had its own class. So at the end of the year, all of the instruments were combined to form
Mm.
the sixth grade band. And because it's very unprecedented, we don't see this in music programs very often in the U.S. But by the end of the year, we were all ready to come together. But during the year, we worked as a class, and there were about 20, 25 saxophone players.
Wow.
Yeah.
And Tim, we know there are different types of saxophones. Which one is the one that you play more often? Or
Yeah, well, so there are four primary instruments within the family: soprano, alto, tenor, and baritone. When you start on the saxophone, that's you usually start on the alto, and it's the primary teaching instrument, and it has the most literature. There are more alto saxophones in a band section than anything else. Um, the tenor and the baritone are considered much too larger for a typical 10-year-old or 11-year-old. So we might start being assigned those other instruments as we would get bigger and older as we move through the band program. Because the band orchestration, this requires the full family, but usually multiple altos, sometimes 2 to 4 altos, maybe 1 or 2 tenors and 1 baritone. And the soprano saxophone is very rare in the orchestration of the band. And also in the high school programs, you don't see a lot of like training music that uses the soprano saxophone. So
Mhm.
the soprano saxophone is considered maybe a little more advanced. It's just a little more challenging to play. It's more you have to be more physically developed.
Mm.
Yeah, and then because it's smaller and the reed is harder, but so it's kind of like playing, oboe in terms of endurance. And so we usually come to the soprano later. As
Mhm.
far as my career, I'm most known for the alto and soprano. But I do have my others with me. So I've been playing tenor and baritone a lot more in recent years, and I enjoy those instruments. I have a new concerto coming up that features the soprano, alto, and baritone all in one concerto. So you have to play all three instruments. You're moving between movements and playing different instruments. And that's not very common either to do
Uh-huh.
that. So
Is that for the Corigliano piece?
yes, the Corigliano. The Corigliano requires three saxophones. And
Mm.
he calls the title of the concerto the triathlon. So he envisions the piece being like a massive, tasking physical thing for the player. And like in a triathlon, you're moving through three major events, right? The running and or swimming and biking or whatever. And so you start on soprano, then the slow movement is alto, and it's just big, long, slow lines that are also very challenging.
Mhm.
And then the last movement you pick up the baritone, and it's just this massive tour de force for the baritone.
That's
So
great.
yeah, so I'm starting to get more in shape on the baritone, literally and figuratively.
As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking of the pieces that I have conducted with saxophone players, and I just think of two of them, which is the Glasunov
Hmm.
concerto for with strings,
Yeah, string orchestra.
and a piece by Radames Nyatali, the Brazilian composer.
Hmm.
Those are the two pieces that I actually conduct. Well, I need to conduct more.
Yeah, yeah. We need you. We need you.
And um, I was I I was thinking when you started playing saxophone, you had in mind going towards classical music, or you also have the experience to play jazz, which is something that we all relate to when we hear about saxophone, no? We think about jazz. Do
Of
you
course.
do both, or
Oh, well, so no, I mean, absolutely. We
of
are very
course?
lucky.
Yeah.
We are very lucky that the saxophone is so popular for like jazz, but I mean, all music really. Like you can find the saxophone virtually in every genre, right? I mean, you're going to find it in popular music, and you can find it in all kinds of Latin bands, and you can find it in rock music, and of course classical and different kinds of classical. But and then of course jazz has many categories too. So there's like really kind of really heavy serious jazz, maybe even avant-garde jazz, but you have smooth jazz, and you have the whole popular Kenny G movement and everything.
Yeah.
So I think growing up, certainly I saw saxophone as a popular instrument. I mean,
Mm.
I didn't know anything about its classical tradition. Um, so I chose the instrument because of its popularity as a popular music instrument. And I grew up in the early 1980s, and so we were seeing music video, television, MTV, right? We were seeing more of this on television. We were seeing more popular music, and many of the rock. I mean, it's kind of gone now, but a lot of the pop bands of the 80s had these big famous saxophone solos, and rock bands or I guess you would call it I don't know, uh, vintage rock or whatever. You heard saxophone. So I think I picked it for that reason. And then my first entry into saxophone was because, I mean, of playing jazz music, but I did fall in love with the playing the music of the concert band.
Mm.
I did love that community. I loved playing in my section. And I was challenged by my conductor, my band director, to really know what a good classical sound was. And when I started taking private lessons, my private teacher gave me some recordings. Very first recordings I had were of some very famous classical players like Donald Cinta or his counterpart at Northwestern, Frederick Hemke, and some other names like Eugene Russo. So suddenly my whole world exploded that there was this whole kind of like underground world, like you had popular music, saxophone, and then you had like this whole current of classical things, classical profession.
Mhm.
And then that took me to the orchestra world because I was curious about where saxophone fit with the orchestra, and of course, it only fits with music that starts in the 1900s. So it took me to Mussorgsky, and it took me to Ravel, and it took me to Bizet, and all of that music, pictures at an exhibition, And I fell in love with that. So from there, I fell in love with the orchestra music that featured saxophone, the concertos and the orchestral showpieces. And then that expanded outward, and I started to learn more about the orchestra generally. I think I fell in love with the orchestra of all music because of the way saxophone gave me an entry point
Mm.
for the orchestral world. And I think that's just where I found I always enjoyed jazz. I played jazz, and I played it in college, and continued to be just to be a good teacher of it, but never really a major performer.
Mhm.
I started to learn very quickly that it was, for me, I mean, it was impossible to do both equally well.
Yeah.
I find it pretty hard for anyone to do it equally well. So the choice I made, when it came to my kind of like fork in the road, I chose classical music because I believed not only did it touch me more, but also I felt I could make a difference. I felt I had more of a chance of making a difference. I felt like jazz was already established with major giants. We had these huge monolithic figures in jazz like Coltrane and Charlie Parker and Rollins, and the list is huge of very famous jazz players, all of whom probably are, it is impossible to do anything to contribute beyond what they did. Everyone is just chasing them, chasing these legends. And for classical playing, I felt that we have many legends that aren't so beyond what we can do. I think we can all contribute and add to their legacy, and that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to take the teachings and the the achievements of someone like Donald Cinta, and I wanted to take what he did and add to it.
Mhm.
And I felt I could do that in classical music.
That's great. Um, I would when you went to Interlochen, you were you there the whole year, or were you there for the All-State program?
So when I was so the when I was a camper,
Uh-huh.
when I was a student, I was there for the whole summer.
For the
So
whole
that
summer. I
back at
see.
that yeah back at that time, the summer was it was an 8 week program, so it was 2 months. And then there's the academy. There's a boarding school. There's a boarding school arts academy the whole year at Interlochen.
Yeah.
And yeah, I did not attend the academy.
Uh-huh.
And but I do have I do have a relationship with that academy. I go once a year and give a master class. I have a nice connection with the saxophone teacher there, and he brings me in once a year, and it's kind of a nice recruiting opportunity.
Yeah.
But yeah, so no, I was a camper. And then when I came back to teach, I mean, so Donald Cinta hired me to come back and be on the staff about right after my freshman year, after my first year of college, he asked me to come and be on the staff. And I worked in the office, I did some administration, and then he had me teach the sectional rehearsals for the saxophone students. But then little by little, and he was the primary teacher, and then little by little, he handed that over to me. So wonderful thing about Donald Cinta is that he's so giving. Like he just gives you his time, and he'll give you whatever you need. He'll write letters for you. He'll give you a book that he's reading, and he'll just hand it to you and say, just give it back to me whenever. I always found he was so giving, but he also was so giving of opportunities. He would pass them along. So
Mm.
I think within 2 or 3 years of being a student of his, he started to give me gigs. He gave me gigs with the Detroit Symphony and Ann Arbor Symphony, and anything that came along, he started to just sort of hand it off.
That's
He started to he had all these connections with composers, and every once in a while a composer would send him a piece and say, this piece has not been premiered. Will you premiere it? And Cinta would probably say yes, but then it would sit on his desk and he'd do nothing with it. And I remember once he gave me a piece and he said, you should give the world premiere of this piece. And I said, okay. And he was like, you should just do it
mhm.
and meet the composer. He's like, it doesn't even matter if it's a good piece, and it doesn't even matter if the composer is famous.
Mhm.
It's an important connection for you to make in the professional world.
Mhm.
So I started connecting more with living composers. I started to realize that living composers were a pathway to a career because they were a larger network in the community. I never was under some kind of misconception that the saxophone could be a permanent member of a symphony orchestra. I knew that was not possible.
Mhm.
But of course, there's a lot of great literature that features saxophone. So I knew, okay, I could have a side career, a side part of my life could be as a substitute musician with local orchestras, and I can play that music. And I'd like to be known as a top call, okay. But I also knew that I would focus on being a recitalist. But I wanted to also commit my life to composers, working with composers, because they need us.
Yeah.
Composers know all around the world that saxophone players are hungry, and that we want to play. We want to play, and we want to make a difference. And part of that is through contemporary music. And
Yeah,
that doesn't, that led me to my career.
yeah, it's wonderful because it's just it's great how everyone it starts creating our own paths, no?
Yeah.
And I was reading about you that you are an advocate of contemporary pieces and contemporary composers, which is absolutely necessary, I think, for your instrument, no?
Hmm.
And um, you have a special relationship with John Adams. Could you tell us about that?
Well, so going back, I mean, going back to looking back on how I positioned myself, I
Mhm.
think going back to those early experiences of working with composers of every level and age. I mean, I think I talk to my students about this very much. How do we build a life from a very small place, our own existence, our own life, and how do we expand outward? And so I talk a lot about to my students, spheres and that in concentric spheres of awareness, like, and you're constantly starting from here and trying to reach out into these outer spheres. And sometimes we look at the music profession and we say, oh, that's not possible. I mean, that's so far outside of what I'm capable of. So we're looking at our opportunities in a small market, a local market. How can we make music, in our city, in our town? And of course, we look at the mainstream, music profession, and we say, well, that's how many people get that chance to make music with Dudamel and John Adams? And we look at that, and it seems like celebrity, like, right? It's like Hollywood classical music. But I just early on, I said, what is the path? What is the path to get to those places? How can I position myself to, I mean, not necessarily play a piece by John Adams, but what do I have to do to 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 get someone like John Adams to hear me, to know my playing? And so I just think from probably, I mean, over 20 years, I was building more and more connections as I was expanding outward. So more and more composers I was working with were from other places and international and out of state and older composers. And then um, I started playing with more and more orchestras. Started becoming more and more of a substitute player. But it led me to the chance. Well, so I joined the very famous saxophone quartet, all Michigan graduates at the time. The Prism Saxophone Quartet. So I've been in that group for 20 years. And that group started at University of Michigan in 1984, all students of CINTA. And they did the same thing. They were committed to the same mission of not only the traditional classical saxophone quartet literature, which mostly was French music from the turn of the century and into like the 1950s, very traditional music, but then they committed themselves to more and more contemporary music. And when I joined the group, we were playing a lot in New York City and other urban areas, and it just continued to build my connections, and eventually um, our composer in residence for a couple of seasons of Prism, our composer in residence was Jennifer Higdon. Okay, so Jennifer Higdon she was starting out. She was very young, and she was teaching. She was already a professor at Curtis Institute, but and she was doing well, but she wasn't as famous as she is now. And she was connected with us, and she would go, and we would do concerts in the schools and the libraries. We would go into the much more socioeconomically deprived areas of Philadelphia, for instance, and we would go and play for libraries and youth programs and very, very poor schools. And we were making music, and she would come with us. You know, Jen Rigdon would come with us, and we would play her music, and she would describe what it means to be a composer. And these beautiful young children were asking her questions about how do you write music, and it was just this great relationship between us. Well, little by little, you know, by 2007, 2006, Jennifer asked me to play her soprano saxophone concerto at the Cabrillo Festival with with Marin Alsop. And Marin, you know, she's one of my heroes. I mean, she's just a giant. She's a giant in the conducting world and leading the charge for women conductors. And as you know, but it was that chance. I think that was the moment that I was finally kind of experiencing and meeting conductors and composers of a bigger sphere, you know, than my world. My little world was kind of now out here. And so I gave the premiere of her soprano saxophone concerto at Cabrillo with Marin. And then the next summer, Marin was recording John Adams' Nixon in China with the Opera Colorado. And of course, the Nixon in China famous opera calls for four saxophones. I mean, talk about one of a major experience for saxophone players to play in that opera. The saxophone parts are very challenging. You have to call in professionals. You can't have just anybody playing those parts. So she won Prism. And then that's what led me to knowing John Adams more, because he heard us play, he heard the recording, he met us, you know, he spent time with us. And so by 2009, uh, John was writing this big piece for Dudamel with the Los Angeles Philharmonic, you know, this massive 35-minute symphony for Dudamel. And it was to celebrate this great Los Angeles history of the cinematic music and all the film noir music of the 1940s and 50s. And John believed that he could not write a piece about Los Angeles cinema without including a big saxophone part. And so you know, it led to them as an orchestra saying, we need to find a really big player, someone who can play this part. Um, and it just led him to looking for me. And they called around. They actually called Donald Cinta. They called other people. And when they called Donald Cinta, they said, who should we call? Donald Cinta said, you need to call Tim McAllister. So, you know, again, back to this wonderful giving man, you know, he would certainly say that he was not, he wouldn't have taken that part at that point in his career. He would probably say he wasn't in that kind of shape as a player, but he was very quick to make sure they knew who I was, and they did, and John knew who I was. So that led to the premiere of City Noir in Dudamel's first concert. And Foreign Press was there, and I took it upon myself, because of this piece of City Noir, because of this piece, the saxophone part is so huge. I mean, I think that the part itself is like 26, 27 pages long, right? The saxophone part and the saxophone part arguably is the hardest part in the whole piece. And I knew what the stakes were. I knew how important this was. So I practiced so much for that moment, and I wanted to make that impression on John Adams that I was, you know, ready. And I think there's a stereotype with saxophone players that I've spent my whole life trying to undo, and that stereotype of saxophone players is that we're not part of the culture. You know, we're outsiders. Maybe we don't kind of blend really well, or that we don't listen very well to the, you know, to the first flute or the first clarinet, or we're not really aware of all the minutia of gestures from a conductor. And maybe the saxophone players, not always, but maybe historically, maybe the saxophone players were like late or not, you know, or playing out of tune or whatever. I just knew that how important this part was, that I had to be the person most prepared. And I took it on myself to do that. And a lot of orchestras, you know, even the Los Angeles Philharmonic, even with Dudamel's first, you know, concert, a lot of orchestras still learn their parts very late. You know, they get their music sometimes on a Monday, or they get their music a week before, and they
Yeah.
got this hard piece. I got my part like a month before, because John was worried. John was worried that it wasn't going to be playable.
Mm.
And so I got my part a month early, and I practiced like it was the end of the world.
That's
And so I think that was an important moment because I showed him something and he heard me. And from that point on, he started recommending me for every time the piece was being programmed. And every time he conducted it, he requested me. And we
mhm.
became like a 1-2 deal through his management company. Like if you wanted to bring in John to conduct City Noir, you had to hire Tim McAllister. So I lucked out there. And to this point in time, I've played it, around the world since 2009. I've played it, over 50 times,
Wow.
like, around the world with probably like 20 different orchestras. Um, and then
This is
in 2012, he called me out of the blue. He brought me in to play City Noir with the New World Symphony probably in 2010, and we hung out and had dinners and whatnot. And one night he mentioned something in passing about writing a saxophone piece, and of course I couldn't let that go. You know, I mean, he said he dropped it in passing, and then people like him say those things all the time. Composers, they'll be like, "Oh yeah, I totally need to write you a piece someday." But about a year went by, and I would email him every once in a while just to kind of give him a little nudge, and I wanted him to remember that he said that.
Mhm.
But it was quiet for about 2 years, and then in 2012, he wrote me to say that he had this gig with the Sydney Symphony down in Australia, and he wanted to write a saxophone concerto for me.
Mhm.
So it was like a dream come true.
Yeah.
It was as if my entire life, as I charted it out, and the way I wanted to get to someone like John Adams, it was an amazing moment to feel like I achieved that dream of
Mm.
getting out from Ann Arbor, Michigan, and trying to expand outwards to get the attention of someone like John Adams. And so there it was, and now I've played that piece. I think I've played the saxophone concerto almost 50 times now too.
Wow.
So between those two pieces, I have a lot of John Adams in my blood. You know?
Yeah, this is a fabulous story, no? And also, thank you for sharing this idea of the sphere, no, to make it bigger and bigger,
Mhm.
um, because somehow we need to find each of us our own way to create this, no,
Yeah,
and as you said, to people to get to know you. So this is fabulous.
yeah, and I think a lot of things have helped us. I mean, social media has helped. We didn't
Of
have that as much. We didn't have that as much even 10 years ago.
Yeah.
I don't think I joined Facebook until after. I mean, I think I joined Facebook after I premiered City Noir.
Mm.
Um, and I didn't really know much about it. And then other things. And so I do think we've connected more, for good or bad. We've
Yeah.
connected more, um, that in a way that now social media is being pushed very much by publicists, PR firms, agents, companies. They feel like we have to have that presence. And you're seeing that all now. We're really seeing that in this COVID crisis. We're seeing that people are reaching out more and doing master classes, and performances online, and we're doing everything we can to keep our brand out there in the world. And I think about how hard that must have been for us 20 years ago when we had no way to get our brand out there other than a website, and the websites were very crude, as you remember. They weren't very fancy. And I guess we had what was oh, I can't remember some of the early site MySpace pages. I don't remember if you remember MySpace, but MySpace pages, that was a way you could put up an MP3, you could put up a sound file of you playing.
Yeah.
I don't know. So now, I mean, now it's so much easier, and so I feel like students don't have any excuses now
Yeah.
not to be able to share and get their brand out there. Maybe there's too many of us. I don't know, but
I remember when I arrived at University of Michigan, and one of the meetings that we had, the first meetings, they told us that we had to have our an email address, and I was like, "What is that?"
Yeah,
No,
right.
like, what
Yeah.
are you talking about? No, to stay connected, and then I suddenly realized that this other world existed. No,
Hmm.
but as you said, we didn't have Facebook, or I mean, it was not part of our time. We just wanted to be practicing and probably sharing with each other. No,
Yeah,
it's
that's all we
very
were doing.
interesting
Yeah,
how,
we were sharing, collaborating, making
yeah,
chamber music, taking auditions,
yeah,
and that was it. And the only way for someone to even know anything about you was to take an audition.
yeah.
Now
And
they know who you are before you ever take an audition. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, you're right.
yeah.
Tim, now you are back in Ann Arbor as a teacher. No, for you mentioned for seven years. This is
Yeah.
your seventh year.
Yes.
Could you tell me how it feels to be back there
Yeah.
and following the legacy of Donald Sinta, no?
Yeah. Well, it's a I've described it before as a glorious burden to follow him, you know. So as we and I think we all would, I mean, I think we all dream, we all have these kind of dreams and fantasies about being the next teacher after our teachers,
Mm.
or or becoming the steward of our teacher's legacy, and we see this, of course, with the long history of violin teachers and their students and their students and their students. And you see in the violin world all the time, you tracing students back to some famous teacher, like the students of Heifetz. Heifetz taught Gingold, taught whatever. I don't know all the legacies, but we can do that, and it's actually kind of an important thing in the piano and violin world.
Mm.
um, to be and really, when it comes to the University of Michigan, I'm the third professor of saxophone, because Cinta's teacher was Larry Teal, who was a very famous Detroit player. He played all the woodwinds. He was in the Detroit Symphony. He played flute, clarinet, and whenever they needed saxophone. But then he himself was so busy as a saxophone player that he decided that he was going to really push his efforts to make it more of a legitimate academic training instrument, for college programs. And as the University of Michigan was growing in visibility, the band program was exploding. And most people don't realize that it was the band program that made the music school known, because of a very famous gentleman named William Ravelli. So William Ravelli, he decided that he wanted to have the best band program in the world. He wanted to have a concert band program that rivaled the Philadelphia Orchestra or the Chicago Symphony.
Mm.
And so he had to have a specialist. He as a band director had a lot of power, Ravelli did, and he demanded that he had a specialist on every instrument. He didn't want anyone doubling. He didn't want a saxophone teacher that taught flute and clarinet, or vice versa. He didn't want a clarinet teacher that taught a little bit of saxophone. He wanted a saxophone specialist. So the biggest person in the area in Detroit was Larry Teal. So Larry Teal was the first professor of saxophone anywhere in the United States. And the saxophone program was created, and the first doctoral program for saxophone was offered in 1953. And then Larry Teal's most famous student, he had many famous students, but his most famous student was Donald Sinta. So Sinta came back to replace Teal when he retired in 1974, and Sinta was there for 40 years. And then after 40 years, they hired me, and it would not have happened if I hadn't raised my visibility, my profile,
Of course.
around the time that I was hired to replace Sinta. I mean, I was already just 2 years into playing the Adams Concerto all over around the world. And so that really certainly helped. I was teaching at Northwestern in Chicago, or Evanston. I was playing with Chicago Symphony whenever they needed saxophone. So I felt a lot of love and affection towards me to bring me home, to bring me back to be the next in line. And it feels amazing to be back. My wife's a composer. Just talking about connections, okay, so it worked out there. My wife's a composer. I met her in Michigan. She was a doctor. We were both doctoral students. Her name's Roshan Etazadi, and
Uh-huh.
she's her father's Persian, and so she has a bit of kind of a mixed heritage in her life, and it finds its way into her musical voice as a composer. Um, and they hired her. They not only hired me for saxophone, they hired her on the composition faculty. Um,
Wow.
so it was a dream. It was a dream come true there for us to be in the same place and
Mhm.
to be hired together. And so to come home to Ann Arbor felt amazing. It felt a little funny going from a big city like Chicago to coming to a smaller college town like Ann Arbor. But what I appreciate and love about Ann Arbor is that it's an international city.
Yeah.
It may be a college town, but the presence of the university is so large, and the fact that the University Musical Society brings in all the famous orchestras to come play in Ann Arbor. I mean, every orchestra that's touring the United States stops in Ann Arbor.
Yeah.
So I felt like, we bring the world to our students. And if our students go study in New York City or Chicago or Los Angeles, okay, they're getting a big piece of the world right on their doorstep. But in Ann Arbor, we're bringing the world to them. And
Yeah.
and that felt, I once I kind of found myself again here and felt kind of reconnected with the community and reconnected with the people like you, our huge alumni base of people that care about this place. It sort of it lessened the sting of going from a big city to a small college town, because I'm traveling just as much, or I'm touring just as much and doing all the same projects I would have been doing.
Yeah.
Um, but to follow a major teacher, even if I'm trying to establish my own identity, to follow a teacher is hard, because his name still is connected. I mean, and even though everyone knows I'm the professor at Michigan now, when people think of Michigan saxophone, they still think of Cinta. And and that's okay, and I'm perfectly fine with that. Because I adore the man. He's like my father, and we talk a lot. We talk regularly. We Before the quarantine crisis, before then we were always seeing each other every month or so for lunch, and
Mhm.
visits at his house. And he's still
Tim,
practicing. Yeah, sorry.
Tim, and what is it about him? Of course, I mean, as a human being, I know he's a wonderful human being, but what is it about his teaching that makes it so special and unique in terms musically speaking?
Well, the legacy of Donald Cinta is that it doesn't matter what instrument you're playing, holding, blowing into, or striking. It doesn't matter what that is. That instrument must aspire to something greater. It doesn't matter. If it's violin, it needs to sound like a singer. If it's piano, it needs to sound like a violin. If it's saxophone, it needs to sound like a piano. Whatever. Just this idea that you must reach beyond the limits of your instrument. As hard as that is, as challenging as that is, to make a violin sing is very hard, right?
Mhm.
To make a pianist figure out a legato that eliminates the percussive elements of the instrument, to create a legato that takes years and years and years of work. To make the saxophone as poetic and as perfect as a clarinetist, or as beautiful as a violinist, that's a lifetime of study. And and and, and but only if you're connected with that. Like, if you don't hear it, and if you're not aware of it, and you're not a consummate listener, then you're never going to be a great artist.
Mhm.
And so he was constantly pushing us to listen to the greatest artists. He didn't want us necessarily listening to saxophone. He wanted us to be beyond what the status quo for saxophone was. He wanted us to be above that. And so we were always listening to cellists. We were always listening to opera singers. And so he had all of his favorite recordings and all of his favorite pieces, and always about how do you connect when you get into a mixed chamber situation, mixed ensembles. How are you going to blend? How do you need to match? Who are you going to imitate? So he did that by modeling. He was constantly playing for us, but more importantly, he didn't want us to stop with just listening to him. So he wanted
Yeah.
us to listen beyond that. So I was going through college, and I felt, and I teach this, of course, today to my students. Like for you and I to connect means that we have to have a shared experience. We have to have a common point of reference. I cherish the ability to have a conversation with a violinist on their terms.
Mhm.
I can talk, maybe you can't talk as much about my literature, but that's not as expected of you.
Mhm.
It's expected of me as a classical musician to know about your instrument, to
Mhm.
know about the pillars of repertoire that define your instrument. And the same is true with the great symphonies, and the same is true with the great chamber music. So as a saxophone player, my way into your world to get your respect is to be able to talk on your terms.
Mhm.
And that was an important gift from Cinta. Be able to talk to any musician on their terms, be educated, and they
Mhm.
will respect you.
Mhm.
And maybe they'll want to play with you. Maybe they'll invite you to come play something they just discovered, like, Villa-Lobos, the Sex Tour Mystique, okay? So maybe they'll hire you to be the saxophone player because they know who you are and they've heard about you. I mean, there's just so much music there that even like a amazing conductor like yourself, there's so much music there that you actually don't know about, that we are constantly trying to elevate. But part of the reason a lot of that music has lost in history, all these pieces written for saxophone, is because 100 years ago the performances were quite poor.
Mhm.
That's the real honesty. I mean, that's a blunt honesty that I think Cinta would put in part on us, and I in part on my students. There's a reason saxophone isn't a bigger classical instrument. But if 100 years ago Brahms heard Donald Cinta, we would have a Brahms saxophone concerto. I guarantee it.
Mhm.
That's who he was, and that's the impact he made on composers. They were so inspired to write for him. So he committed, certainly by the early mid 1960s, early 1970s. Donald Cinta committed to saying, okay, we lost out on Brahms, we lost out on Copland, we lost out on Bernstein.
Mhm.
Never again. Never. We lost out on Bartok. We have pieces that include this saxophone, but we don't have solo pieces, right? Solo repertoire. And he missed out on a commission by Aaron Copland. Aaron Copland was set to write a piece for Donald Cinta because Aaron Copland was blown away by Donald Cinta's playing. And Copland wanted so much money for the piece, and Cinta had no money and funds to pay for it. There was no grant foundations. There just wasn't, he didn't have any donor relationships. As saxophone players, we're kind of loners, we're out there just kind of doing our own thing, but he had no connections to fund a Copland piece.
Mhm.
And so Copland's next piece so he skipped over writing saxophone piece. The next piece he wrote was the duo for flute and piano.
Mhm.
And that's a piece that did get funded. And we listen to that. Oftentimes, saxophone players, we listen to that piece and we think that's our saxophone piece that we missed out on. So he didn't want us to ever miss out on anyone ever again. And
Mhm.
I think that was my goal. What could I control in this kind of microcosm, macrocosm? And when I was asked, when I finished my doctorate at Michigan, in my final oral exam, my final oral exit exam with my committee,
Uh-huh.
one of the questions, I think Evan Chambers, a great composer on the faculty at Michigan, I mean, Evan
Yeah.
Chambers asked me the question, if money was no object and you could commission anybody, who would you commission for your instrument? And it was a test. It was a test. He wanted to know my knowledge of composers. He wanted to
Uh-huh.
know my thinking and my tastes.
Mhm.
But I thought about it for a moment and I said, you know what? It's impossible to name one composer because there's so many kinds of music, in classical music, of contemporary music. So he said, okay, fine, name three. Name. He said, fine, name three. And I said, okay, number one. So this was year 2001 or two, I think.
Uh-huh.
But I said, okay, no, okay, one, John Adams. Okay, that's what I said. I said number two, John Corigliano.
Uh-huh. Wow.
And I said number three was a composer who's still alive, who's big in Germany, Wolfgang Riem, R-I-H-M. So Riem
Uh-huh.
he's got some amazing pieces, but more of a heavier contemporary your Germanic, tradition. But I was listening to him at the time. I mean, I was listening to his violin concerto and some other pieces, and
Mhm.
Boulez was conducting his music a lot. But anyway, I mean, I of my dream list, I got two of them. Yes.
Amazing.
But I,
Good,
but
good
I
question
try to,
from Evan Chambers.
yeah. See, yeah. So I mean, so I teach this a lot to my students. And there's a very famous quote by Peele. Shoot for the star. Sorry, aim for the moon, and you'll shoot for the moon, and you will reach among the stars.
Mm.
And if you put a goal in front of you that is so beyond anything you could imagine, and you scratch and claw to reach that goal, along the way you will have arrived at some kind of career, a substantive, meaningful career of some sort. You may not even realize it. And
Absolutely.
you may take it for granted. You may take it for granted that you have a job, or you have a career, or that you're playing a little bit, or you have wonderful community of friends that you make music with.
Mm.
But some people, I think one of the problems in our profession is we put limits on our happiness, and we decide that we're not going to be happy unless we're conducting the Los Angeles Philharmonic. And that we can't assign happiness to that.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
I,
you have a wonderful, fruitful conducting career, you
yeah.
know, and but if you decided that you wouldn't be happy unless you were Dudamel, well, then you'll never be happy, because there's only one Dudamel, you know,
Exactly.
right? So I started to feel the same way about being a saxophone player. I wasn't going to be sad about that I don't have the violin literature, or that we're not as famous as Yo-Yo Ma or whatever. I wasn't going to be sad about that. I was deciding that, okay, I'm going to make my place. I'm going to fight for that spot. If I don't reach it, great, fine, but I will have reached something. And that's what I have to impart to my students now, and especially right now, with the COVID crisis. We don't know how this is all going to look when we come out on the other side.
Mhm.
We don't know what's going to be left of our industry, but we have a chance maybe to start over, or to reposition ourselves, or the people who are most driven and most committed to making a difference. I do think they'll have a place in all of this. I think
Absolutely.
I do. I feel like we're going to get a bit of a reset in some ways, right? I don't know how you feel about that, but
No, absolutely. And also these are the times also that uh, give us a challenge of proving our character too, no?
yeah,
And our strengths, and also to observe our weaknesses and work on them, no?
yes,
This is the time to
yeah,
do it.
this,
So
yeah,
we end up in a better place after we finish with all of this, no?
yeah, I believe so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're going to see the foundations and the societies, the musical societies, the organizations, the government organizations and the private organizations. I think they're preparing to help rebuild this. I think the orchestras are being as visionary as they can be, with social distance programming, but we're seeing orchestras lead the way out of this darkness. But
Mhm.
but chamber music is going to prevail. Small music is going to, smaller sinfonietta programming. There's a silver lining here, that some of that repertoire is coming back into the light. The pieces like Strauss and Dvorak serenades and
Yeah.
Mozart serenades, and small, chamber symphonies. Some of that's coming back out of necessity, out of social distancing.
And I
We're
think it's fantastic.
I think so. I think so. Yeah. And for us, I mean, we feel like chamber music, like saxophone quartet, that's a possible. I mean, we know that we have a shot at being some of the first out of the gate to come back. Because we're portable. We're not going to play to giant halls. We'll play to smaller crowds. Smaller chamber recital halls, but we can also do the streaming, and we can do. Maybe all of us have just been forced to come up to terms with the technology. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
I was gonna share that clip of you of my video.
Yeah.
Because
Actually, I would love if you could do it, so we can
yeah,
also
let's
hear
do
you
that. Yeah,
play,
okay.
and to realize of what you have been doing also in these times of
Yeah,
pandemic.
yeah. So okay, when the pandemic happened, I think we were all just blindsided about what to do. I mean, in our case, for instance, at the University of Michigan, they said March, I don't know, it was March 11th or something, March 12th.
Yeah.
They said, "Done, we're closing. Everyone's closing. You have and that's it. And you have a weekend. We had a weekend to move all of our teaching and curriculum to online."
Mm.
And you're asking professors who, some professors never had done that before.
Mm.
Now, I had done some of that before, but nothing beyond my laptop. Right now I'm using a web camera. I have a nice microphone. I have a couple of nice microphones, and I have nice lighting that I purchased. I mean, I was very lucky and very fortunate and privileged to have a little extra money to be able to buy all this stuff.
Mhm.
But I think about some of my poor colleagues, professors and pianists that were in their 60s and 70s. Like Donald Sinta could not have done this.
Yeah.
I'm in my basement. I have a nice corner with a wall here, and I can kind of use this as a recording space.
Mhm.
And I felt like, and I guess this is just who I am. I'm kind of an overachiever, but I just felt like if we're going to move to this, then I'm going to do it as well as I can do it, and I'm going to be the best model I can be for my students. But I still had to figure out best recording microphones and best how should I do some editing and how. So everyone started doing their COVID remote videos, and so my pianist Liz Ames, we released 2 albums this summer from pre-recorded material. But we decided to do a couple of these COVID remote videos. So I thought I would share one, since
Yes.
you had asked about it. Also, this was all overlapping with this huge upheaval, civic upheaval in the United States. We're really, really, I think it's a wonderful movement for the Black Lives Matter movement, and pushing more and more awareness of composers and performers of color, and becoming greater advocates and allies for women and in music. I mean, this all kind of overlapped, and so I decided to record the great William Grant Still's Romance for saxophone. So his one piece he wrote for saxophone is saxophone and orchestra.
Mhm.
I've played it once with orchestra. I thought it was one of the most beautiful things ever. And this is the version for saxophone and piano that I recorded remotely with Liz Ames. Liz Ames lives in another part of Ann Arbor. She recorded the piano part. She did all of that. She sent me the piano part. I studied it, and followed and rehearsed with it, and then I recorded my part with it, and then we combined the video. So I thought I would share that with you here. And it's
Great.
just like 5 minutes, or I can cut it short. I know we're starting to run short on time possibly. So, um, okay, so this is William Grant Still's Romance. Where did it go here? And this, it is with saxophone and orchestra, and this is the piano version. Yay.
Beautiful, Tim.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing beautiful music too.
Oh, sorry. Hold on. That's the next file. Please. All right. Sorry. That's my part of my YouTube channel kept going. Okay. Let me come back now.
Well,
Now, you know, the that piece, for instance, it was written in 1954. It's with orchestra, and
mhm,
I would still say that there's probably a good 30 or 40% of our profession of saxophone players don't know about that piece.
mm,
You know, that's again, just kind of this whole white Eurocentric view of classical music, and the fact that we have this incredible representation of a piece within the Black community is it's just kind of like criminal that we don't know about that piece.
yeah.
And when I got to play it with orchestra a couple of years ago, under Gary Lewis, actually. Gary Lewis was at Michigan when you were there too. I worked with his orchestra down in Texas, Midland Odessa Symphony, and we wanted a little encore piece after a concerto we were doing of Ken Fuchs, and then we wanted a kind of like just some kind of encore. And I said, you know, let's pull this piece out, and I'd never done it with orchestra before, and we had to track down the parts and rent the parts, but everyone in the orchestra, every single person came up to me after that and were just so smitten with the William Grant still.
Mm.
And it's just another example of how we have to keep bringing this music to the public because it's too beautiful to have been forgotten or underappreciated.
Mm.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tim, and 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 thank you again for being with us this morning. It has been really special to have you here and to get to know you a little better.
Yeah.
and and we had some friends that shared that were here with us this morning, like Katri, Ervama,
Oh, wonderful. Yay.
yeah, Sabine. I don't know if you remember
Yes,
Sabine.
of course.
And so thank you again for giving the time to these conversations, and I hope we will keep in touch,
Absolutely.
create new musical opportunities together.
I would love that. Let's collaborate sometime when we can.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, it was
And
wonderful to see
so
you, and it's wonderful to follow your successes and the difference you're making, and you're bringing a bit of that Ann Arbor magic to your world, you know. So,
thank you. And so thank you everyone for being with us this morning, and thank you again, Tim, for sharing your life experience and musical experiences, and I will see you next Sunday.
okay,
Thank you very much.
thank you, everybody.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.